It's May 2nd, 2025. Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're pulling together a whole range of sources, trying to get a clear picture of the major global and domestic events happening right now.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack. We've got economic reports, world news summaries, WHO updates, science news.
Exactly. Info from Banka Polem, the Daily World News Summary, the WHO Hub, the Indian Express for Science, the Canada Report on Office Tech, AP on Trump and Trade, Vlasdi America for a global view.
Quite the mix.
Our goal really is just to pull out the key insights for you, connect some dots, and, make sense of what's important without it being overwhelming.
Sounds good. Where should we start?
Okay, let's dive in. Maybe start stateside. The political landscape seems, pretty active.
Yeah, that definitely jumps out, especially the news about the National Security Council. Quite a shakeup there.
Right. The Daily World News Summary laid that out. Marco Rubio is now interim NSA, while still Secretary of State.
That's right. And Mike Waltz, he's out as NSA, been nominated as UN ambassador. Alex Wong also dismissed. It's abrupt.
Holding both state and interim NSA. Hasn't that happened before? Reminds me of Kissinger or someone.
It does, yeah. Kissinger held both roles. It's a significant concentration of power in Secretary Rubio's hands.
And this is happening against the backdrop of Signalgate. Wasn't there some context there with Waltz?
The reports mention that, yes. And difficulties attracting new talent. So, it raises questions. Will this streamline things, or does it risk instability?
What about morale within the national security apparatus, or how allies might see this?
Exactly. Those are the concerns highlighted. Stability, morale, international trust. It's something to watch.
Okay, staying with domestic policy, there's also an executive order targeting PBS and NPR funding.
Yes, aiming to defund them. The justification given cites radical and woke propaganda and bias.
That feels like, another step in the ongoing tension between the administration and certain media institutions.
It certainly does. And the financial impact could be significant, especially for smaller local stations.
Because they rely heavily on that CPB funding.
Many do, particularly in rural or underserved areas. Losing that could really hurt access to local news, educational programming, even things like emergency alerts.
And the timing is interesting too, Reg. Didn't the CPB recently sue the administration?
Good point. Yes, that happened not long ago. So it's hard for observers not to see this move as perhaps applying pressure.
Then there's the creation of this new Commission on Religious Liberty. What's the mandate there?
It's pretty broad. To report on the history, impact, threats to, and preservation of religious freedom, with a specific focus on things like parental rights, school choice, conscience protections.
And the people appointed, I saw names like Dan Patrick, Ben Carson.
Cardinal Dolan, Franklin Graham, Paula White too. Yes, a lot of prominent conservative figures.
So what are the different viewpoints on this?
Well, the stated goal is promoting religious freedom, but critics are calling it a dangerous political witch hunt, potentially with an anti-Muslim bias.
So the concern is it might prioritize certain beliefs over others.
That's the worry some have expressed, yes. That the focus and composition suggest it might champion specific conservative religious views rather than safeguarding liberty for everyone in a diverse society. For you, the listener, it's about weighing that stated intent against those criticisms.
Got it. We also saw May Day protests across the country yesterday.
Right, and the reports suggest it wasn't just traditional labor rights this year.
Seems like a convergence of causes. Labor, immigration, pro-Palestine movement, education funding, social program cuts.
Exactly, all sort of unified by opposition to the current administration's policies. Figures like Bernie Sanders were involved, highlighting that broad coalition.
So it really shows a widespread discontent on multiple fronts.
It does seem to reflect that, yeah. Different groups finding common ground in their opposition.
Okay, shifting slightly, the DOJ is now suing Illinois over an immigration law.
Yes, SB 0508. The federal argument is that Illinois' law interferes with federal authority on immigration.
How so? Is it about employer verification?
Primarily, yes. The DOJ says Illinois is creating conflicting rules around E-Verify and I-9 forms, imposing its own penalties, and that treads on federal ground.
So an escalation in that conflict between the federal government and states with, let's say, more pro-immigrant stances.
Definitely an escalation. It's a classic federalism dispute playing out in the immigration arena.
And then there are these conflict of interest concerns swirling around Elon Musk.
Right, specifically related to the Golden Dome anti-missile defense contract. There's a formal request now for the DoD Inspector General to review it.
What's the core issue? His different roles?
That's the main thing. He's CEO of SpaceX, which is involved in the contract, but he also holds multiple government advisory positions. SGE, DOGE.
DOGE. That's the new defense tech group.
Yes, the Defense Optimization and Guidance Executive. And the concern is that directives coming out of DOGE could potentially impact regulators overseeing Musk's other companies.
So, advising the government while his company bids for government work.
And potentially having influence over regulations affecting his companies or access to data on competitors. Plus, Space Force contracts, broadband grants, even Tesla contract info mentioned as concerns.
That sounds complicated.
It is. And this reported subscription model for SpaceX's role in Golden Dome is also unusual. It raises questions about transparency and national security implications if conflicts aren't managed incredibly carefully. For you listening, it touches on that line between private industry and government roles, especially in defense.
Finally, on the U.S. front, there's a poll showing growing public concern about the public health system.
Yeah, a Harvard poll. It indicates an anticipated loss of trust in agencies like the CDC.
But isn't there a partisan split?
Very much so. Democrats anticipating losing trust, while Republicans anticipate gaining trust. It really highlights the politicization.
What are the specific worries people cited?
Things like political influence creeping in, program cuts affecting services, downplaying of health issues, less access to information, all things that could really hamper public health efforts if that trust keeps eroding along party lines.
Okay, let's pivot to the U.S. economy. The April employment report actually came out today, May 2nd.
Right. We had the March numbers, 228,000 jobs added, unemployment at 4.2%, and the forecast for April suggested things might cool down a bit.
Maybe 130, 140,000 jobs. Unemployment steady.
That was the expectation. Slight uptick in wage growth, maybe. So today's report is key to seeing if that slowdown, maybe linked to tariffs or federal spending cuts, is actually happening.
And this comes after we saw the economy actually contract in the first quarter of 2025.
Exactly. That BEA report showed a 0.3% annualized decrease in Q1 GDP. First decline in 3 years.
What drove that decline?
A few big things. A massive jump in imports, up 41% annualized. Also, consumer spending slowed down, only 1.8% growth, and federal government spending fell 5.1%.
Wow, that import surge is huge. Is the thinking that companies were trying to get ahead of tariffs?
That's the interpretation many analysts have, yeah. Front-loading imports before potential further trade restrictions or higher costs hit.
But you mentioned private domestic demand was still okay.
It was resilient, actually, grew 3.0%. So the underlying demand from consumers and businesses wasn't the main issue in the contraction.
But inflation, that wasn't good news.
Yeah, definitely concerning. The PCE price index jumped to 3.6%, core PCE to 3.5%. That's way above the Fed's 2% target.
Which makes the Fed's job harder.
Much harder. Slowing growth and rising inflation. That's the combination that fuels those stagflation worries. A really tricky spot for monetary policy.
And speaking of tariffs, they remain high on Chinese goods.
Very high, up to 145% mentioned in the sources, and efforts in the Senate to limit the president's tariff authority were blocked.
We also saw the elimination of that de minimis exemption for small shipments from China and Hong Kong.
Right. That loophole allowing low-value items in tariff-free is gone. That directly impacts e-commerce sellers like Shein and Temu.
And probably means higher prices for consumers buying those goods.
Almost certainly. The administration also framed it partly as a way to combat fentanyl trafficking.
Are big companies feeling the pinch?
Seems so. Apple is reported to be anticipating significant costs and adjusting supply chains. Toy retailers are warning about potential shortages and price hikes later in the year.
So, real-world impacts starting to show. What about financial markets?
Increased volatility. Analysts are split. Some see growth recovering later. Others worry about recession risk. We're also seeing reports of foreign investors pulling back and, interestingly, increased Chinese investment in gold may be a safe haven move.
And China itself is looking at U.S. trade proposals.
They're evaluating them, yes. And you see the international concern reflected elsewhere, too, like May Day protests in Europe and Asia mentioning trade policies.
Okay, let's shift gears to U.S. immigration policies. There was a reversal on a policy affecting international students.
Yes, thankfully. ICE reversed a policy that led to SEVIS record terminations and visa revocations for over 1,200 students. This came after lawsuits were filed.
That must have caused huge disruption for them. Job losses, study interruptions.
Absolutely. Risk of deportation, too. ICE is developing a new framework, and in the meantime, they're taking steps to maintain or reactivate the SEVIS records.
But what about the visa revocations? Are those automatically fixed?
That part seems uncertain still. which leaves students in limbo and, potentially damages the U.S.'s reputation as a top destination for study long term.
We're also seeing increased ICE enforcement activity.
Yeah.
Operation Tidal Wave in Florida.
Right. That resulted in a record 1,120 arrests in less than a week. What's unusual is the involvement of state agencies you wouldn't normally expect.
Like the lottery, Fish and Wildlife.
Exactly. Alongside traditional law enforcement, IC stated the targets were people with deportation orders, criminals, gang members.
But were there reports of others being caught up in it?
There were. Reports of arrests during traffic stops, individuals without criminal records being detained. And this use of a task force model allows local police to make immigration arrests, which is a shift.
And there was also that raid in Oklahoma City, framed against open border policies.
Yes, targeting a suspected human and drug trafficking safe house linked to a cartel. These enforcement actions are often positioned within that broader political narrative.
But the impact on immigrant communities
Likely increases fear and anxiety, yeah. Which can unfortunately make people less willing to report crimes or cooperate with police generally, impacting public safety.
And what's the situation with refugee policies?
Still quite restrictive. The U.S. Refugee Admissions Program, USRAP, remains suspended indefinitely.
That affects people already approved, like Afghan SIV holders.
Yes, including those stranded in places like Pakistan. We also see continued deportations of Nepali-speaking Bhutanese refugees back to Bhutan, where they face statelessness.
Is the administration exploring other options?
Reports mention exploring third-country agreements, potentially with Libya and Rwanda, for deportations.
Though there was a legal setback regarding Venezuelans.
Right. A federal judge in Texas blocked the use of the 1798 Alien Enemies Act to deport Venezuelans, specifically citing concerns about sending them to El Salvador, but the administration is still pushing to end TPS for Venezuelans.
Okay, let's quickly touch on some key global news highlights from the summaries. Europe first.
Okay, Europe. The IMF cut UK growth forecasts, citing US tariffs. There's an ongoing investigation into that big power blackout on the Iberian Peninsula. French union leaders criticized what they called the Trumpization of global politics.
Politics in Germany.
Germany's SPD voted to form a coalition with the CDU-CSU, and the EU told its officials no meetings with Huawei lobbyists.
Got it. Asia.
China is evaluating U.S. tariff talk proposals, and its investors are reportedly moving into gold. South Korea facing political instability before elections. Bank of Japan lowered its economic outlook, also blaming U.S. tariffs.
Taiwan and the Philippines reacting to trade issues too.
Yes, Taiwan's president linked tariffs to needing a domestic stimulus, and May Day protests in the Philippines targeted Trump's trade policies. India urged a Gaza ceasefire and closed airspace to Pakistan after a terror attack.
Middle East.
An Israeli airstrike reported near the presidential palace in Damascus. Iran condemned new U.S. sanctions and Trump's threat about oil purchases. UN court hearings on Gaza aid continue. And Netanyahu stated defeating Hamas is the priority over hostage release for now.
And briefly, Africa.
UN urging a ceasefire in Sudan's Darfur region. A UN aid request out for major flooding in Somalia. And Kenya submitted an updated climate action plan.
Wow. Okay, a lot happening globally.
Okay.
Let's turn to science and technology now. This Generation Gold Standard Vaccine Initiative from NIHHS.
Yes, that's generated quite a bit of buzz. It involves redirecting $500 million from Project NextGen.
Towards what kind of vaccines?
The goal is universal vaccines, like for influenza and coronaviruses, but the approach is using chemically inactivated whole virus technology, specifically with BPL, and maybe intranasal options.
BPL, is that a newer technology?
Actually, no. It's an older method that's been largely abandoned in recent years for vaccine production. That's part of the controversy.
What are the other concerns?
Well, bypassing typical peer review for the initiative, limited preclinical data being shared, skepticism about whether this older tech can really be as effective as, say, mRNA vaccines for universal protection.
Something about clinical trials.
Yeah, the reported requirement for placebo-controlled trials for any new vaccine under this program, even if effective ones already exist. That's raising questions about ethics and potential politicization of the science.
Okay. What about semiconductors? There's new legislation.
Yes, the Building Advanced Semiconductors Investment Credit, or BASIC Act. It aims to boost the investment tax credit to 35% and extend it.
This comes after a lot of investment already, right? Since the push for a stronger domestic ecosystem started.
Huge investment. $540 billion in private funds, over 100 new projects announced. The Semiconductor Industry Association welcomed the BASIC Act, but wants it expanded to cover R&D and design, too.
Makes sense. AI and quantum computing still moving fast.
Incredibly fast. IBM announced a massive $150 billion investment plan for U.S. tech development, including AI and quantum. And acquisitions happening too. Right. Palo Alto Networks is acquiring Protect AI, which focuses on AI security, a growing area. And IonQ reported progress using hybrid quantum classical methods for things like fine-tuning LLMs and material science image generation.
So real applications emerging beyond just theory.
Definitely. We're seeing AI impact software, drug discovery, medical diagnostics, though challenges around funding and ethics certainly remain.
Lots of other tech news, too. Inhalable vaccines, diabetes tech.
Yeah, advancements there. Updates from Medtronic, Boston Scientific, J&J MedTech. Neuralink got FDA breakthrough devices status for its speech restoration work.
Space tech.
Amazon's Project Kuiper launched satellites. Rivada Networks expanding its outer net. NetXT Semiconductor and BAE Systems working on space-qualified chips. And Parsons showed off new tech for Special Operations Forces, biometrics, anti-drone stuff.
Shifting to biomedical research, what's new there?
Some interesting studies. Mass General Brigham used a mouse model to confirm oxidative stress links to hypertension and aortic aneurysms, identifying a potential drug target called DUSP3.
And something about detoxifying mercury.
Yeah, UCLA and UC San Diego researchers engineered gut bacteria in mice to detoxify mercury, reducing its absorption, and even fetal exposure could have big implications.
And kidney disease research.
Stony Brook looked at how certain kidney cells communicate in diabetic kidney disease, offering more insight into that complex process.
There's like a ton of other scientific discoveries were reported too. Quantum, AI training, even history and biology.
Absolutely. MIT had a Quarton coupler for faster quantum operations and solved a long-standing quantum math problem. UPenn developed a photonic chip for light-speed AI training.
Plus things like wine history, honeybees.
Yep. Findings on ancient viticulture, inflammation and pain, placental gene differences, exercise and cognition, Alzheimer's vaccine progress, longevity proteins, pea genomes, healthier honeybees, even tattooing tardigrades. Science marches on across many fronts.
Okay, and lastly, some specific health and policy news points. Semaglutide Ozempic Wegovy showing effectiveness for liver disease.
Yes, a study in the New England Journal of Medicine found it effective for treating MAH, a type of fatty liver disease. That's significant.
Then an HHS report on gender dysphoria treatments.
Right. That report questioned hormonal and surgical treatments for youth, prioritizing psychotherapy instead. That's generating discussion.
Measles treatment guidelines.
HHS Secretary asked the CDC to develop guidelines using specific drugs and vitamins given the recent outbreaks.
Any policy changes from NIH or related to health insurance?
NIH halted funding for foreign subawards. The GAO is analyzing Georgia's Medicaid work requirement program, sparking broader congressional debates on Medicaid reforms. And Aetna announced plans to exit the ACA individual markets in 2026.
And efforts against fraud. Other health IT news.
CMS launched a new fraud detection operations center. CISA warned about a potential credential compromise at Oracle Health Center. And the AMA is backing bipartisan legislation for more substance use disorder treatment centers.
Okay, phew. That was a lot to cover. So as we wrap up this deep dive, it really strikes me how, well, interconnected everything is. U.S. policy choices clearly have these global ripple effects. Economy, trade, alliances.
Absolutely. And just the sheer pace of change across politics, economics, science, medicine, it's really something. It presents huge opportunities, but also, considerable challenges.
Thinking about that rapid pace across all these different domains, trade, politics, science, what do you see as maybe the most significant long-term consequence of the trends we've dug into today?
That's a big question, I suppose. Maybe it's increasing premium placed on adaptability for individuals, for businesses, for governments, the ability to navigate this constant interconnected change and uncertainty, to learn continuously. That might be the most critical skill or characteristic needed for the future. These trends point towards resilience, maybe?
Adaptability and resilience, definitely something for all of us to think about. Until next time.